it's Tucker. Today we are looking at revenge pranks that crossed every line, turning a bitter payback into the absolute final joke. From an arrogant athlete trapped inside a sauna with no way out, to a Halloween prank that left a man searching for an exit that was already gone. It was the evening of May 26, 2017, in a mid-sized college town in Florida, and the streets were quiet as Daniel Mercer walked alone along a familiar pavement at around 7 in the evening, a routine route he had taken many times without concern. Daniel Mercer, 25 years old, was an IT support technician known among his former university friends for frequent teasing and joking that sometimes went too far, leaving some people embarrassed or humiliated. After graduation, the group stayed loosely connected, but relationships soured after an online incident in which private disagreements were made public, causing lasting resentment toward Daniel. Over time, several former friends began privately discussing a revenge prank. What they eventually called it was a controlled fear scenario, a staged abduction intended to scare him and then reveal it as a prank. They had talked about it in pieces over several weeks, but never properly planned it out. There were no safety boundaries, no guidelines for how to restrain him, and no abort plan. One member had raised concerns, but the rest of the group brushed them aside. Someone in that van knew this was wrong before it started, said so, and was outvoted. I wonder how that person has lived with that since. On the night itself, they used an older, poorly maintained black van with a rear sliding door that did not always latch cleanly unless slammed shut. All of them wore masks for the effect, and when Daniel reached a quiet stretch of road, they pulled up abruptly. They moved fast, grabbing him before he could fully react, forcing him into the back, covering his head and binding his wrists. The door slid shut and the van pulled into traffic, accelerating toward the highway and heading out of town toward a rural location where they planned to reveal the prank. Daniel believed he had been kidnapped. With his vision blocked and his hands restrained, panic took over instantly and completely. As he struggled violently inside the moving van, his body slammed against the rear door as the vehicle moved at highway speed. What none of them had assigned was responsibility for the rear compartment. The van rear door was not properly latched, and as Daniel's struggling weight pushed against it in the midst of the chaos, it slid open and he fell onto the highway without warning. A passing vehicle struck him almost instantly. The driver had no time to react. The impact caused severe multi-system trauma, critical head injury, internal bleeding, and multiple fractures across the torso and limbs. The van ahead screeched to a stop as the group realized what had happened. For a short period, there was confusion and panic inside the vehicle. Arguments broke out, disbelief set in, and it took several minutes before anyone called emergency services. For several minutes, nobody called emergency services. They were arguing instead. I have sat with that detail for a long time, and I still cannot find a way to make it less than what it is. When paramedics arrived, Daniel was still alive, though in critical condition. He was stabilized at the scene and transported urgently to the hospital. Despite intervention, his injuries were unsurvivable, and Daniel Mercer died later that night. Investigators reconstructed the incident through vehicle examination, phone records, and witness statements. They concluded there was no murderous intent, but the actions constituted a clearly foreseeable chain of reckless behavior, unlawful restraint in a moving vehicle at highway speed with no safety controls. The group faced charges including unlawful confinement, reckless endangerment, and negligent homicide. The court made clear that good intentions did not remove responsibility when the risks involved were obvious and could easily have been prevented. In the end, what began as resentment hardened into something far more irreversible, not because anyone planned a death, but because no one planned anything at all. The next case involves a group that also told themselves it was just a scare, except this time the target was locked inside a room that kept getting hotter, and nobody stayed to check. It was the 18th of August, 2017, privately operated combat sports gym in Birmingham, where evening training had stretched late and recovery areas remained intermittently supervised. Darren Cole, 27, an amateur heavyweight fighter, had a documented reputation among members for aggressive sparring etiquette and repeated low-level misconduct, including mocking inexperienced trainees and hiding personal equipment. Complaints had been raised informally over time, but were largely dismissed by coaching staff as toughening behavior within a competitive environment. Tensions had escalated earlier that summer after Darren humiliated a teenage trainee during a crowded session, filming the incident on his phone while others laughed. Following that event, a small group of athletes privately discussed retaliatory payback, framing it as a short scare rather than serious harm. On the evening in question, Darren entered the gym's dry sauna alone after training. At the time, multiple zones of the facility were active, and supervision in the recovery corridor was minimal. 3 athletes athletes later admitted they placed a rigid gym bar and a resistance strap across the outer frame of the sauna door assembly. The obstruction did not rely on locking the door, but interfered with the outward swing and latch clearance, effectively preventing normal egress from inside. They then left the corridor, believing the situation would be noticed quickly. Darren initially treated it as a prank, shouting and striking the door. Mobile phone footage later recovered showed brief laughter and recording from outside the corridor before the group dispersed. Within minutes, attention in the gym shifted to an unrelated dispute in another training area, and nobody remained to monitor the sauna corridor. I still don't understand why they left believing it would be noticed quickly. No plan, just sheer assumption. Inside, Darren attempted repeated forced exits. The sauna unit continued operating at high temperature, and investigators later estimated he had been exposed for approximately 50 to 60 minutes before discovery. Witnesses reported intermittent banging, but ambient noise from adjacent training zones masked the sound. The aging sauna unit had no timer, alarm, or emergency release mechanism, and access to the corridor was not formally controlled. Staff assumed the recovery area was unoccupied during the late session. Security footage showed the corridor was not re-entered for roughly an hour. By the time someone finally came to open the door, Darren was unresponsive. Emergency services were called, but he was pronounced dead by the time they arrived. He suffered from hyperthermia and severe dehydration, consistent with prolonged heat exposure. Toxicology found no intoxicants. Digital evidence recovered from mobile devices included messages referring to locking him in for a scare and recording his reaction. Investigators concluded that the decision to lock him in was deliberate and that the risk of serious harm was something anyone could have clearly seen coming. 3 athletes were arrested and later charged with gross negligence manslaughter and false imprisonment. Prosecutors noted that while there was insufficient evidence of murderous intent, the conduct created a clearly dangerous situation that escalated beyond control. Following the case, the gym's operators introduced mandatory internal release handles, timed cutoff systems for sauna units, and revised supervision protocols for all recovery areas. 3 people walked away from a door they had blocked, certain someone else would deal with it. The next case takes place underwater, where 3 men invited someone onto a dive boat and made sure one small adjustment to his equipment would be waiting for him. It was February 2018, somewhere off the coastline of Goa, India, where a chartered dive vessel sat anchored approximately 3 miles from shore above a recreational reef, and where a man who had come looking for a fresh start was already wearing sabotaged equipment. Rohan Mehta was 36 years old, a co-founder of a marine tourism company. The company specialized in guided scuba diving experiences for foreign tourists along western India's coastal regions, achieving moderate success through partnerships with beachfront resorts and seasonal diving tours around Goa's reef sites. As time went on, disagreements grew inside the company over how equipment was being maintained and whether safety procedures were being followed properly. Rohan eventually accused his partners of faking inspection records and misusing company money. The accusations became public and destroyed the company's reputation, forcing it to shut down completely. People who knew the group later said that the remaining partners held Rohan personally responsible for everything they had lost. Despite years of hostility, communication resumed in early 2018 when a former partner invited Rohan to a fresh start meeting aboard a licensed charter vessel operating 3 miles offshore near a reef site. The invitation had been framed as a reconciliation, a chance to settle old disputes and discuss new ventures, and Rohan had accepted. At some point before the dive began, while equipment sat unattended near the rear rack of the vessel, one member of the group partially loosened a low-pressure hose connection on Rohan's alternate regulator. Court testimony later suggested the intention was to frighten and humiliate him underwater, to force an aborted dive, to make him feel, as deleted messages would later confirm, what helpless feels like. Nobody anticipated a tragedy. The dive began normally during the late morning, the group descending along a reef wall in calm conditions with visibility of around 10 to 12 meters. For roughly 20 minutes, nothing appeared wrong. Then Rohan began signaling. A loosened connection had been progressively destabilizing his airflow, and as his breathing resistance increased, so did his exertion and stress. The current was now pulling the group further from the ascent line above. Sediment stirred up near the seabed clouded the water and made it nearly impossible to see clearly during the ascent. The group began drifting apart, and one diver's attempt to share an alternate air source with Rohan became difficult to maintain in the murky conditions. Controlled ascent procedures broke down under the compounding pressure of drift, separation, restricted breathing, and rising panic. Rohan Khan lost consciousness before reaching the surface. The people on that boat knew he would panic. That was the point. I think they just did not understand how fatal even a minor scuba interference can become fatal once panic steps in. Recovery personnel retrieved him from the water shortly afterward and transported him back to shore, where emergency resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. Forensic inspection later identified interference inconsistent with normal equipment wear, and deleted messages were recovered referencing deliberate plans to make him panic underwater. The investigation shifted from accidental fatality to criminal sabotage. All three former partners were arrested and prosecuted. Prosecutors argued that deliberately interfering with life support equipment in an underwater environment constituted reckless disregard for human life, regardless of what the group had intended. Marine safety specialists confirmed that even relatively minor scuba system interference can become fatal once panic and disorientation develop at depth. The next story stays closer to the surface at a house party in Brisbane, where a group of friends decided to give a prankster a taste of his own medicine and discovered that some people, when genuinely terrified, do not react the way anyone expects. It was on the 22nd of September 2018 in Brisbane, Australia. A house party in the suburbs became the focus of a criminal investigation after a revenge prank designed to frighten a social media personality escalated into a fatal emergency. Ethan Cole, 28 years old, worked as a residential real estate photographer for a Brisbane property marketing company. Outside work, he spent much of his free time producing prank videos for social media, gradually building a modest online following through prank videos. His content often involved elaborate practical jokes presented as spontaneous reactions. While many viewers found his videos entertaining, several people featured in them described the pranks as humiliating and deliberately distressing, including fake job termination calls, staged breakups, and simulated emergencies. Tensions peaked after Ethan uploaded footage of a friend experiencing what appeared to be a genuine panic attack during a staged kidnapping prank. A small group of friends began planning a way to give Ethan a taste of his own medicine, selecting his annual birthday gathering as the setting. The plan involved masked participants staging a fake robbery while informed guests played along. Nobody discussed how Ethan might react if he physically resisted, and unknown to most participants, Ethan had recently become deeply concerned about local burglaries in his area. What I find so funny is that the people planning this knew exactly what kind of content he made, and they used it as their template. That right there is an ironic plot twist. On the same evening, around 30 guests attended the party. Shortly after 10 p.m., 3 masked participants approached through a side entrance while another disabled the exterior lighting. Several guests had been told about the prank, others had not. At around 10:15, the masked participants pushed through an unlocked rear door shouting demands that resembled a violent robbery. The performance appeared far more convincing than organizers had anticipated, with guests screaming, furniture knocked over, and many believing the threat was genuine. Rather than recognizing the prank, Ethan attempted to confront one of the masked intruders while directing guests toward safety. During the struggle, Ethan and one participant crashed through a glass patio door and fell onto the concrete outside. A large section of fractured glass penetrated Ethan's upper thigh, severing the femoral artery. Panic immediately replaced the prank. Some of the guests tried to help stop the bleeding, but the cut was too deep. Emergency services were called within minutes, with responding officers initially believing they were attending an active violent burglary after receiving multiple calls reporting masked offenders. Despite emergency treatment and rapid transport to hospital, Ethan died from catastrophic blood loss. Police quickly determined the event had been staged after reviewing mobile phone messages, planning discussions, and video recordings recovered from guests. Investigators found no evidence that participants had no intent to seriously injure Ethan, but concluded they had knowingly created circumstances in which a reasonable person would believe a violent home invasion was occurring. Several organizers were prosecuted for negligent conduct and dangerous acts resulting in death. Prosecutors argued that simulating a violent robbery inside an occupied home created an obvious risk of resistance and serious injury. Investigators concluded the fatal outcome resulted from a predictable human response to a perceived life-threatening threat rather than any planned act of violence. Ethan died because a prank underestimated the person it targeted. The next story takes place in a boarding school in Nigeria, where a prank intended to embarrass a bully sent him running through a corridor that had more working against him than anyone in that building knew. On the 12th of May 2018, a boys' boarding school in Ogun State, Nigeria was operating its regular Saturday routine, with students moving between early sports and hostel cleaning before the mid-morning rest period. Tunde Adebayo, 17, was a senior student known for intimidation of juniors, including confiscation of belongings and verbal threats. While complaints existed, disciplinary response was inconsistent, and senior-junior conflict was often informally managed without strict enforcement. Over time, resentment built among junior students, particularly in shared spaces where supervision was limited. After sports activities, students returned to the hostel in a crowded flow, increasing movement along the upper corridors and stair landings. The three-story male hostel consisted of tightly packed corridors linked by stair landings and an upper balcony-style walkway. A section of the outer railing near the staircase landing had been scheduled for maintenance due to corrosion, requiring temporary removal of a short segment during repair work. A group of juniors planned a prank intended to humiliate Tunde by removing his clothes while he showered and recording his reaction as he chased them. The intent was embarrassment, not physical harm. To increase the embarrassment, one student poured some vegetable oil onto the tiled corridor near the staircase landing, expecting Tunde to slip and stumble during the chase and become the subject of ridicule. It formed a thin, uneven, low-visibility film across several feet, reducing traction without being obvious. At the same time, maintenance work was active on the upper walkway adjacent to the stair landing. A short railing section had been removed for repair, and although caution tape was present, it was loosely secured and did not fully block access points. No staff member was actively supervising the area during the transition between work stages, leaving a temporarily exposed edge in an otherwise protected walkway. Shortly after exiting the bathroom, Tunde discovered his clothes missing. The situation escalated quickly as nearby students shouted and moved away, drawing more students into the corridor and increasing congestion and noise. As he pursued them, he moved through a crowded corridor with limited visibility of floor conditions. He stepped onto the low-friction area and lost traction. His attempt to recover balance failed as his motion became unstable, and he collided with the corridor wall, redirecting his momentum toward the stair landing and adjacent walkway edge. He entered the partially isolated maintenance zone and fell through the unguarded gap where the railing section had been removed, dropping from the upper level to the floor below. He sustained severe head and multiple traumatic injuries. Emergency response was immediate, and he was transported for treatment but was pronounced dead before arrival at hospital. The juniors who took his clothes were only trying to embarrass him, not hurt him. I am certain nobody foresaw this outcome. It's unimaginable. Investigators concluded there was no intent to cause serious injury or death. However, the actions were classified as reckless due to the foreseeable risks created by forcing a chase through a crowded corridor combined with a reduced traction surface and proximity to an unprotected structural edge. The outcome was attributed to cumulative negligence and risk convergence rather than a single act or deliberate intent. Following the incident, the school implemented stricter maintenance zone controls, improved physical barrier requirements for elevated walkways, and strengthened supervision and disciplinary response to inter-year conflicts. The case was closed as a preventable fatal accident arising from compounded environmental, behavioral, and procedural failures. Tunde died at the intersection of several small failures that nobody had connected. The next story takes place on Halloween night in Ohio, where 4 teenagers locked a classmate inside an abandoned house and had no idea that someone else had already been inside it with a candle. It was the 31st of October 2017. The streets of a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, were full of costumes and laughter of people celebrating Halloween festival. Somewhere in an isolated street, a Halloween prank intended to scare a classmate would end in fatality. Maxwell Parker, a 17-year-old student who was known for humiliating younger classmates. Over the previous year, Ethan had gained a reputation for stealing costumes during school events, posting embarrassing videos online, and disrupting neighborhood Halloween activities. Several local teenagers had grown increasingly resentful. Rather than confronting him directly, 4 of them planned what they called a Halloween scare. They chose an abandoned Victorian-style house that had sat vacant for years. The deteriorating building was a popular gathering spot for teenagers, despite repeated warnings from authorities. Many first-floor windows had been boarded up following years of vandalism, leaving the front entrance as the main practical route in and out. On Halloween night, the group convinced Maxwell to visit the house by claiming expensive expensive electronic equipment had been hidden there as part of a challenge. Their plan was to lock him inside temporarily, play pre-recorded sounds through hidden Bluetooth speakers, and release him after about 20 minutes. Shortly after 9 p.m., Maxwell entered the house carrying a flashlight. Once inside, the teenagers secured the front door from outside using a wooden board. Hidden speakers began playing distorted voices, footsteps, and other unsettling sounds throughout the building. Believing the hidden equipment might be upstairs, Maxwell moved deeper into the structure and searched several rooms. At first, he assumed he was the target of a prank and shouted insults toward his friends. However, his frustration soon turned into panic when repeated attempts to leave failed. Unknown to the group, the abandoned house was occasionally used by transients seeking shelter. Earlier that evening, one occupant had been using candles and a small portable stove in an upstairs room. At approximately 9:10 p.m., a candle tipped onto nearby debris. The resulting fire spread from papers and fabric to old curtains and dry wooden flooring. After unsuccessfully trying to extinguish it, the occupant fled. Outside, the teenagers initially overlooked faint smoke coming from an upstairs window. By the time they realized a real fire had started, smoke had already spread through parts of the second floor and stairwell. Panicking, they removed the barricade and shouted for Maxwell to come outside. Witnesses later reported hearing him yelling from inside as smoke filled portions of the building. Firefighters arrived within minutes, but heavy smoke and the building's deteriorated condition complicated rescue efforts. After the fire was put out, Maxwell Parker was found inside the building and was later confirmed dead. Doctors said he had light burns, but the main cause of death was smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide poisoning, which means he breathed in too much toxic smoke and could not get enough oxygen. The fire was caused by an accident involving a candle left burning by another person in the building. However, investigators said Maxwell could not escape quickly because the front door had been blocked. This delay made the situation worse when the smoke spread. The 4 teenagers were charged with unlawful confinement and reckless endangerment. They did not plan for anyone to die, but their actions helped create a dangerous situation. The fire had nothing to do with them. A candle in an upstairs room, a stranger they never knew was there. What they contributed was the locked door, and in a burning building, a locked door is everything. The next story moves underground to a tunnel network beneath Manchester, where a group of men did something quieter but no less deliberate. They removed the markers that would have led their former friend home. It was on the 19th of January, 2017 in Greater Manchester, UK. Severe rain warnings were issued across the city, and stormwater had begun to overload older drainage systems beneath the city's industrial districts. Somewhere below those streets, a young man was about to run out of time. Daniel Cross, 29 years old, was a freelance industrial photographer from northern England who specialized in abandoned buildings and post-industrial landscapes. His work gained a steady online following within urban exploration communities, where he documented disused tunnels, factories, and restricted underground sites that few others had previously accessed. He had recently fallen out with his exploration group after leaking private conversations online. The fallout was bitter, and several members blamed him for damaging their reputation across multiple exploration communities. When the group contacted him weeks later claiming tensions had eased, Daniel believed them. In the days before the meeting, several members planned what they described in later messages as a panic lesson. They chose a Victorian-era tunnel network beneath Manchester's industrial quarter, known for unstable brickwork, poor visibility, and connections to storm overflow channels capable of flooding rapidly during heavy rainfall. Before Daniel arrived, members removed portable LED route markers used to identify junctions and exit paths, and concealed Bluetooth speakers loaded with construction collapse audio designed to disorient him once he became separated. Shortly after midnight, the group entered through an unsecured access point. For nearly 40 minutes, the exploration appeared routine. Then Daniel became isolated near a branching corridor where the markers had been removed, and the recorded collapse sounds began echoing through the tunnels. At first, the others laughed over the radio. Then his transmissions became increasingly distressed and incoherent as he struggled to find the exit in the dark. Above ground, rainfall intensified rapidly. Water began surging into the lower corridors through the older overflow connections beneath the district. None of the group had confined space rescue training, flood monitoring equipment, or any emergency evacuation evacuation plan. The water rose faster than they anticipated, reducing visibility and cutting off sections of the return path. Several members recognized the danger and climbed out through the maintenance shaft. Some later stated they believed Daniel had located another exit route. He had not. Emergency services were not contacted for approximately 45 minutes after the group surfaced. They believed he had found another way out. I do not know if that is true or if it is simply the version of events that was easier to live with afterward, because they surfaced and waited 45 minutes before calling for help. Rescue personnel entered a tunnel system already filling with cold, fast-moving water and near zero visibility. Daniel was located unconscious inside a partially submerged corridor almost 300 meters from the nearest accessible exit point. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. The medical examiner recorded the cause of death as drowning complicated by hypothermia following prolonged exposure to flood water. Digital forensic investigators later recovered deleted group messages discussing plans to leave Daniel underground long enough to induce panic. Multiple participants were prosecuted for gross negligence and unlawful endangerment resulting in death. The tunnel access points were later sealed, and regional guidance concerning flood risks inside abandoned underground infrastructure was expanded following the investigation.